This is the web transmission service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. At our last Defence and Security Studies event of spring 2025, we welcomed Dr. Sean Maloney of Royal Military College, who spoke to us on the Cool War, nuclear force signaling and the Russo-Ukrainian War.
We know that Dr. Sean Maloney is a professor of history at RMC, and he served as the Canadian Army's historian for the war in Afghanistan. He deployed to that country 11 times and was subjected to IED attacks, as well as direct and indirect fire in the performance of his duties, as was I, but it was by Americans. It's true. He's dedicated his career to producing a body of work that captures the Canadian Army's Cold War and post-Cold War experience. He has taught at RMC since 1998. Now, the subject tonight is a very interesting one. When I first saw his title, The Cool War, I was thinking cool as in, oh man, this is really cool. But no, that's not what he's talking about. Cool as in the opposite of the hot war. And he's going to focus on nuclear force signaling and the Russo-Ukraine war. And I believe that this is a kind of an outline to an upcoming book. Is that?
Yes, this is part of, this actually led to the book. I did this lecture the night of the attacks in February 2022.
Okay. Okay. So there's a book coming, and we will keep our eyes out for that, obviously, and we will assist in that process. So without further ado, let me turn this over to Dr. Sean, and we'll get on with this, and we'll go from there. Thank you.
It's good to be back. This subject, how do I introduce it? This started off almost by accident in 2021. Me and a couple other friends were watching very carefully what was going on, and I became increasingly alarmed with some of the things I was seeing in the open source, and that essentially led. This lecture here is sort of the streamlined version of one that I gave the night of the initial attacks. So this lecture will actually stop that night, but I'll show you how much was going on even before that. Okay. And there's actually 2 or 3 other lectures that go on this, but the book itself covers the entire 2014 to 2022 period. But today we're just going to deal with 2022. So what we're dealing with here, we're dealing with nuclear signaling, okay, or nuclear messaging. Has anybody seen the movie 13 Days? Okay. In that film, there's a very critical scene where the McNamara character and the Admiral Anderson character have a discussion in the naval plot. Now, one thinks that they're engaging in a blockade, and the other one realizes that this is a new language between Kennedy and Khrushchev during the Cuban Missile Crisis. That the actual use of military forces is a language to communicate between the two sides. Okay, and that's sort of what we're going to look at here. But signaling has been integral to deterrence, going right back to the 50s. And I wrote another book dealing with this. It basically deals with nuclear war planning and deterrence throughout that crucial period. And out of that, I was able to distill a lot of things that have been either forgotten or papered over. These are basically what I call LeMay's deterrent principles. And this has a direct bearing on what we're going to talk about. So Curtis LeMay is running Strategic Air Command, and basically this is how he sees deterrence. Okay? Visible capability, this is the critical thing. Has to be public, has to be seen, all right? Large-scale exercises training. The ability to hit targets under any or all conditions. Okay? Flexibility, ability to respond under any or all conditions. Penetration capability, to have the constant back and forth of being able to get through an air defense system to remain credible, and then provide options to the political leadership. Okay? This here is actually the basis for what the Americans were doing for the period we're talking about over the long term. Okay? The key part is this visible capability part, because back then you had limits on that. Now you don't. So during the Cold War, and we all would have been brought up with this in various academic environments, you have general day-to-day movements of forces that demonstrate readiness, basically. You can have crisis signaling before a crisis actually gets off the ground, where you're maneuvering stuff maybe to avoid a crisis. You can have signaling during a crisis, say in the Cuban Missile Crisis. and in fact, the crisis itself might be a signal. Okay, so that's sort of how we understood signaling back then. And again, it's a bit of a basis for what we wind up doing later. And the methodology back then, besides pounding on the lectern with a shoe, we're dealing with public statements, diplomatic commentary, propaganda apparatus, in this case print and radio, movies to a certain extent, the maneuver of military forces, either conventional or nuclear. Okay, so this is sort of how signaling worked back then. These are the means. And these means are still used, but I'm going to show you how it's radically changed. Okay, now if I had time, I'd go into the whole change of what happens inside Russia, but we'd be here all night, and most of you people are familiar with it already. But the development of what we are up against now starts around 2000, and it will be refined progressively throughout the 2000s up until what we wound up seeing in 2021. So, key thing to understand here, and I have to emphasize this, there's a concept that's thrown around called hybrid warfare. Okay? When I'm looking at the origins of this, the Russian words are hybridные methoды, or hybrid methods. And when you start drilling into Valery Gerasimov and actually where he's borrowing these ideas from, i.e. his predecessor, this is what we're up against when we're dealing with signaling during the Russo-Ukrainian crisis, and even before that, okay? So those signaling methods we talked about during the Cold War, which are kind of, you sort of pick this and use that, pick that, use that. This is the combination of everything to accomplish political objectives or national objectives. And nuclear signaling fits within this. It's not separate from it, okay? And this is another concept we need to understand for the lecture, combat potential. And this is drawn from the Russian Strategic Missile Forces definition. And my take on that is there is concern of combat potential of any given weapon system at any given time, okay, in terms of its proximity to your forces, your country, etc. And combat potential, for example, today, or back then, B-52 bomber used to carry basically 2 gravity bombs, and then 2 gravity bombs, two cruise missiles to blast away through the air defense system in the 1960s. Today, a B-52 carries 20 cruise missiles. So when you've got 2 aircraft flying on the periphery of Russia, that's 40 cruise missiles, potentially. And you don't know what kind they are because you can't see into the bomb bay. That's ambiguity, right? So when we talk about combat potential, it's what something could do at a particular time. And that is taken very seriously, particularly by the Russians, okay? And they think we do it too. We just don't do it as in the same fashion they do. Is everybody okay with that? All right. So, another aspect of this to further confirm that what they're doing is in fact signaling. Dmitry Peskov on 18 February basically says, when we're maneuvering stuff, the audience are your experts. Okay? Now, the reason I put this in here is I ran into a lot of skepticism in the early days of this. People are saying, oh, this is a coincidence. This is, you're reading too much into this. Anything to deflect from the possibility that what is occurring is signaling. Okay? And then he pops up and confirms that okay. This is an important chart. This is actually right out of the book. And I use this to explain how things are actually interconnected. The target audiences here aren't just the policymakers, but ultimately, yes. Social media and mainstream media, yes, but the key things here are the advisors and the think tanks, okay? Our opponents have taken a great deal of time to influence this via this, because material that they're using is based on here and then flowing it up there. So it's an indirect way of influencing policymakers. All right, and we can debate how direct it is with certain personalities, but that's the objective. So how do you influence that? There's sort of 3 clusters here. You've got Russian media, okay? You've got the various apparatus, either non-military within the government, and then you've got the Ministry of Defense with its mechanisms, And the central coordination mechanism under Putin, I found out from a source who's looked into this. There's a document that comes out basically every morning that's several inches thick. It sets the themes, information ops themes for the day, and then that's transmitted out to the various people that need it. Okay? And you'll notice that military movements and exercises are part of this. All right, and I'll get into that. Whenever we see that stuff announced in public, that comes right from him. He signed off on it. All right? It's not delegated, let me put it that way, the way it is here. So everybody's good with this? And this is what we're going to be looking at, and this is coordinated with the other activities when they're trying to influence what we're doing. So, new dialects in our language. From the Cold War, we didn't really have cyber, now we do. Social media, obvious, I mean, that's now a truism. This is what I'm going to focus on here, is air traffic control data. I'm not going to get into the maritime AIS stuff tonight, but we're going to deal with air traffic control data. Because a lot of people don't know about this. And let me give that some explanation. This material, or the availability of this information, only came into the public domain probably around 2019, 2020. Every aircraft squawks on a various systems, so the air traffic control knows where it is. The Russian nuclear command and control aircraft are technically civilian airliners, and they operate amongst civilian airliners. So once you build a database and you know which aircraft is which, and you see what they're doing, then you can gain insight into how they're operating. Okay, and the same with the Americans. And over time, it became very, very clear that all sides in this use air traffic control data as signaling. And I'll show you specific examples of this. Getting people who are hung up in Cold War ideas of signaling to understand and accept this is extremely difficult, mostly because they just don't know the technology. And then it takes, you develop a skill of looking at it and trying to interpret it. And that's not easy. I've been looking at this stuff for like 5 years, and you start developing, you get a gut feel on things, right? So let's jump ahead to when we start seeing things go wrong. So in fall 2021, the Russians run a major exercise called Zapad 2021. Now, you go back to 2008, 2009, they have several regional exercises and they rotate depending what region in per year. And then they'll run what are called supplementary exercises, which are the same size as these, but they're discrete off the books ones because of CFE, right? So this is the one they run, and it's operating in Belarus and in Kaliningrad, and obviously within Russia, close to Ukraine. And that obviously is of serious concern because you get influx of tens of thousands of troops in here, ostensibly on exercise. Could that be used as a springboard to go after Ukraine, right? The second thing that's happening is there's extensive gray zone warfare being directed against the Baltic states, but particularly Poland. Migration warfare by Belarus, okay? And this is getting everybody tied up. The media is getting involved in this. They're trying to embarrass the EU. There's a lot of focus on this. So Zapad is happening, and this is happening. It's the concern here is there's a flashpoint here triggers a pod turning into an invasion of Poland or Lithuania. So that's what people are thinking at that point. And what's that a distraction from? Anybody? The buildup off Ukraine. So this is taking a lot of focus away from what's going on elsewhere, deliberately. And that's when I start looking at or stumble across the movements of the nuclear command and control aircraft. So just to give you a rough idea, this is a Tupolev 214 PU command post aircraft, distinguished by its communication systems. There's a set number of these, and these basically you'll see the maneuvering and the frequency of their maneuver becomes the signal or the importance of what's going on. So I'm watching a whole bunch of these move around, right? And the one I keep seeing the most, and I wind up calling this the Kozelska loop. Plane takes off here, flies down for about an hour, and comes back. Now, in 2021, they're doing that once a month. By the end of 2021, they're doing it maybe twice a week. And then it goes up from there. So what's the deal? So why are they signaling by increasing the number of planes put in the loop over time? But the frequency's high. So what does that mean? Does that increase readiness? So I start looking at this a little further. And I find out that this, during the Cold War, this was an ICBM field. But then it's been upgraded for the post-Cold War period. Most, and you'll see this a bit later, most Russian ballistic missiles, ICBMs, are on trucks. They're mobile. But these guys aren't, and these guys are at the westernmost end of a chain of sites across Russia. Now, why is that? Because one or more of these carries a missile without a nuclear warhead that has a transmitter that says go. Okay? And my analysis is that that plane comes down and does a radio check with that particular silo and the apparatus there. Now, we're getting into the weeds technologically, so you have to stick with me here. So if they're checking the readiness of this system and they're increasing the number of times that they're doing that check, what does that tell you? Okay? And they know we're watching it too, so it becomes a signal plus an increase in readiness. Make sense? All right. That's not the only one. In November, now, an IL-96-300 PU, this is the equivalent of like Air Force One. There's 4 of them. Okay? They're hardened. They're Putin's nuclear command doomsday planes, basically. Okay? And this is the Ukrainian border here. There's Kharkiv. This one comes down here, circles around, like right on the border, right within the Ukrainian air defense envelope. And then winds up landing over at Voronezh. This has never happened before, it never happened again. But when it happened, it coincided with it stepped up diplomatic activity by Russia targeting Ukraine. So we can read into this, but to have that kind of asset that close should be seen as some kind of intimidation. And there may be other things that I don't see or we don't see in addition to that. But that's unusual to have that kind of asset that close. Okay? Now, U.S. side. I was watching this at the time, and then I went back and reconstructed it. But this is the E-4B. There's 4 of those. These are the nuclear command and control aircraft run by Stratcom. And I caught this guy in December. Now, why is this significant? Did everybody see this loop here? Okay. This aircraft carries an antenna that can go out several kilometers out the tail of the plane, so it can do low frequency or extremely low frequency communications with submarines, specifically ballistic missile submarines. And the fact that it's over Lake Superior and it has its trailing wire antenna deployed is really significant. They're talking to submarines. Now, why are they doing that? So I'm back and trying to reconstruct exactly what those planes had done throughout the course of the year. Only on one occasion during the course of the year, they ran a major exercise where they're doing this. And they're doing this as the crisis is ramping up. So that got me really interested. I'm like, okay, so if they're running, and we can see it. So they want it to be seen, obviously, by the other side. And it's happening roughly at the same time we're talking about the other stuff. So I'm looking at this going, okay, this is interesting. This is serious stuff. So let's take a look at the other aircraft, the E-6B Mercuries, run by the U.S. Navy, that also have a function for communicating with submarines. And guess what? Roughly the same time, you see this squiggle here? The plane flies like this so the antenna drops down so they can do low frequency talking to ballistic missile submarines. And you're looking at it right there. I screenshot that right when it was happening. Okay, so now we got a bunch of planes that are talking to submarines. That's not good because that's the basis of the U.S. deterrent. And they want people to see it, so there's signaling going back and forth. And so that's when I started take a much more closer look at what's going on. And then there's this guy, Cobra Ball. This guy has a series of sensors on this side of the aircraft. His purpose is to watch basically the edge of space for incoming reentry vehicles. Or in this case, I found there's a correlation every time he goes up, there's a hypersonic vehicle test either by North Korea, China, Communist China, or Russia. So they use this guy as an early warning system, and it's interesting. There's his loop there. That's in North Dakota. The ABM sites that were shut down in the 70s are located right there. And they were there geographically because of the need to be able to shoot down ballistic missiles. So this guy's performing some kind of early warning function. So keep those aircraft in mind, because when you start seeing them in combination, that's when it gets interesting. So I'm watching Cobra Ball do that, and I go, that's interesting. So we'll move into the next period. So there's stuff going on, and I'm still trying to figure it out, and then all of a sudden flooded with information. Key event, New Year's Day, one of the 4 British ballistic missile submarines deploys in the open, in the daylight. Like, what civil servant is working on 1 January? Anyone? Uh-oh, we got people falling asleep. All right, so this is really significant, i.e. they deploy a major asset like that on New Year's Day. Now, in Russia, what's New Year's Day mean, Eric?
I mean, it's their Christmas,
Right.
their big party.
You got it. So, all right, start seeing how these things start to line up, right? And then on 5 January, we have all of a sudden unrest in Kazakhstan. And this really throws off whatever the Russians were doing. This was not generated externally. It was an internal event that led to a backlash, and the CSTO had to come in, led by the Russians, to put it down. But this becomes an interesting event, and we're still piecing it out. The Russian reaction is to deploy airborne forces in, along with other CSTO members, to try and suppress the rioting. There's a nuclear component to this, because historically they always do this, going back to Hungary in 56, Czechoslovakia in 68, etc. They always will activate a nuclear component before they intervene. So I don't know what that looked like, but they did something. Because there was a major shift in the US strategic posture over a 2-hour period. Okay? So 15 tankers, no nuke command and control aircraft, and then bang, they double the number of tankers, they put up 2 E6s, they put a Cobra Ball on. And then they reduced that posture later on to about, they reduced the number of tankers, and then I noticed some of the tankers were over Canada. Now, of note, I can't see what the B2s are doing because they're visible, right? B-52s sometimes, B-1s sometimes. What you can always see are the command and control aircraft and the tankers. Okay, so that happened. So I'm looking at that going, okay, what the hell's going on here? And then something happens again, and this is, again, we're really close to the event. So some of these pieces of the puzzle aren't there. Something happens between 10 and 13 January. And the US response exceeds even the last one. Okay, so you're looking at large numbers of aircraft, command and control aircraft, 43 tankers, that's a lot. Trailing wires over Lake Superior, B-52s squawking off once they cross the Canadian border, tankers over New Brunswick and Manitoba. I'm watching all this take place. So, and this is happening over basically a 4-day period. At one point, they've got an E-4 orbiting NORAD headquarters. Okay, now, this sort of thing was not happening in 2021, and it definitely was not happening in 2020. Okay, so this is really significant, and it's generated by whatever's happening on the other side. But again, it turns out, I find out later, tens of thousands of Russian troops started moving towards Kharkiv on an unscheduled exercise, and then they stopped after all the signaling was going on. Got it? And then revelations of the false flag operation that the Russians were going to use to trigger this war. This was preempted by the American intelligence apparatus and the Pentagon and the White House. Basically told the world how the war was going to be triggered because they'd intercepted the other side's plans. So, and what did that consist of? My best analysis of this is it was going to be a chemical attack on a grade school, deliberately designed to kill children and film it and use that as the pretext to invade Ukraine. Okay? And there's different variations. I identified 5 different variations of that plan from varying sources. That's released to the media in various forms. That puts a stick, that throws off the Russian plans by at least 4 days. And how do we know this? Captured Russian documents later on show that there's, oh my God, we've got to stall for 4 or 5 days. This throws them off big time. Now, This is part of the puzzle that's really, really interesting, because I had a retired US 3-star freak out when I put this in the presentation. So this is a ballistic missile submarine, USS Nevada. This is a tweet from the Chief of Naval Operations on Twitter identifying the fact that this ballistic missile submarine is at Guam. That never happened. These submarines are never, ever identified as to their location, because that makes them vulnerable, obviously, and they're a deterrent. Those carry basically 20 missiles with up to 10 RVs per missile, so possibly 200 nuclear weapons per submarine. So hold that thought, okay? They announced that this is visiting Guam while all this other stuff is going on. Oh, and then they announced that there's an E-6B visiting Guam too, its command and control element. Now, can everybody see these yellow dots here?
Yeah.
Okay, those are most of those are mobile ballistic missile units in across Russia. If you look at where Guam is and you draw a straight line over this, it's not difficult to see what the messaging is. If you're going to be able to fire 20 ballistic missiles, each with up to 10 reentry vehicles, you can technically saturate all of that. And that's not all. The U.S. announces that a guided missile submarine is visiting Cyprus. And this carries about 220 to 240 Tomahawk cruise missiles, conventional. Okay? So, and you don't talk about where these things are. So now you've got an SSBN out at Guam, and you've got an SSGN in Cyprus. And guess what? Those are the range gates for the cruise missiles. If the SSGN is stationed here, that's how far in it can go. You get the idea. Now, one's conventional, one's nuclear. We've been sort of conditioned to think during the Cold War that nuclear war is just about nuclear weapons. Now you basically have hybrid kinds of warfare where you use conventional munitions potentially to start something, and then you follow up with nukes or various forms of that. But also in terms of, as a conventional and nuclear deterrent, they become blended in ways that they weren't during the Cold War. And that's what you're looking at here. Okay, the U.S. is telling the Putin regime, yeah, we got 240 Tomahawk on tap here, and about 200 nukes as well. So, you know, we have the ability to escalate if need be. Okay? So, how does the other side respond? This is a Topol M or YARS, depending on what variant it is, and this is a ballistic missile capable of hitting North America. Okay? Can everybody see that image okay? You see there's 4 of them camouflaged here. This is a typical base, and it'll hold about 28 of those. In terms of, that's a missile division. So, and there are a number of MIRVs per warhead, per missile as well. And so when they will start cycling these and telling us about it. So what they'll do here is all the ballistic missiles will disperse from the bases, making them harder to destroy. Obviously, the silos, it's fixed, you can hit it. Mobiles, harder. And the missile division that gets exercised in response to what's going on with the submarine is right here in Novosibirsk, and it's right opposite the American Minuteman fields in the north part of the U.S. So they're saying, all right, we'll match you. How do we know this? They tell us. Remember, go back to the chart where Putin signs off on public announcements of strategic missile exercises? That's exactly how we know about it. Now, the intelligence apparatus will have even more. But they want us in the analytical community to pick up on this and be scared of it and transmit that fear throughout the analytical community. Oh my God! If they've used drones to destroy strategic bombers, they're going to use nuclear weapons in response. Does this sound familiar? Right? This is designed to generate fear. And another command and control aircraft, southwest of Moscow, flying around. At the same time, they're exercising the missile forces. Okay, so everybody's got a sense of the language, right? So now we're at 20 Jan. Remember, we're a month before the next phase of the invasion of Ukraine, and they run a major exercise up in the Arctic. Right, backfire bombers, tankers, blackjack bombers, tankers, and these are cruise missile pest dispensers. These guys are designed with standoff weapons, and they got command and control aircraft we can watch. So NORAD, same day, announces they're doing an anti-cruise missile exercise. So these guys are not operating with impunity up in the Arctic. NORAD's up there, including us. Okay, and then try finding information on this, other than we're on an exercise up in the Arctic, right? So, here's what happens for the rest of the month. Again, I won't read all that out to you, but you get the idea, right? Every other day, there's something going on. They exercise like 1, 2, 3, well, they re-exercise that. They will exercise 4 of the 12 missile divisions in the entire RBSN. And they're doing exercise in the Arctic with Bear aircraft, with cruise missiles, the whole bit. All bang, burst of speed. So does everybody start seeing that there's a dynamic here that's detectable? These are the mobile ICBM divisions here, so you have to get a sense of it. They're all over the place, and those are deploying. They'll disperse the vehicles out to bring them back in. Then they do another one in the Arctic at the beginning of February. Now, why is this significant? What's starting to happen in February 2022? Anybody?
Invasion.
What's happening in Canada?
Couldn't tell you.
Trucker convoy fair. Okay, hold that thought. So this is significant. They're doing a lot of exercising on 2 Feb. A lot. At the same day, and this is weird. That's a U-2 that I've seen orbiting over White Sands Missile Range, i.e. over the Trinity site, which is right there. So somebody's doing some kind of esoteric signaling using a U-2. Now, there are a number of things like this that I identified. They all stop on 24 February. So we can't tell if it's just air crew screwing around or if this is part of a larger information operation run by the US Air Force. And I've had debates about this. I've got one of them flying the word bad over Dugway Proving Ground, which is a chemical warfare site, right? And of course, does that have a relationship to signaling the other side about we know what you were going to do? This is where we start getting into the dots are not as close as I'd like them to be, but the information is there. And this sort of thing, this kind of stuff stops once things get really serious. This is the U.S. response. They take 3 E6s and they deploy the trailing wire over Gulf of Mexico, Pacific, and Atlantic, all at the same time, i.e., and they put the Cobra ball up, i.e., they're sitting there saying, they're doing comms check with all the nuclear missile submarines. And again, the beat goes on. Like, we are way beyond Cold War signaling tempo at this point. Like, just look at that, given what I've explained to you. They take 10 backfires from Belyaev, which just got hit the other day, and move them around. This is interesting too. Backfires over Belarus, they'll take a pair of backfires and they'll fly them at the Polish border and then turn away at the last minute. And the Poles turn on all their air defense systems. Like, this is bullying of a NATO ally. And of course, they're cycling the ballistic missile units. Matching U.S. moves, it's a little more, this is where it gets interesting. Everything I just showed you there is happening during the trucker convoy. And I've done later analysis of Russian media about the themes they're using. So there's a relationship between the nuclear force movements, their propaganda and I.O. output, and their pressurization of the Canadian government. So while Trudeau's and crew are trying to handle the trucker convoy, they're getting constant alerts up in the Arctic, which is putting pressure on the Canadian government. This is hard for people to grasp. How do you measure that, right? Why would you do that? But that's what's happening. The Putin regime is pressurizing Canada. Canada is in a crisis, and they're deliberately putting pressure on us. Okay? Now, what's significant here, on 10 Feb, 4 B-52s, you can see them take off from Minot. And we know they're headed for the UK. But actually, 3 of them go to the UK, and the other one overflies Ottawa. That's it right there. That's a B-52 flying over Ottawa. I took that when it happened. So three bombers go over the Arctic. This guy comes over Ottawa, tanks up off Maine, and goes over to the UK. Well, guess what happens? The day after this, the Russians stopped maneuvering forces up in the Arctic. They stopped manipulating ballistic missile units. Boom. So, Canada, under the US nuclear umbrella, and all of a sudden, the activity up in the Arctic stops. Okay? Let me show you the shift in messaging. So the other side, whenever they do this sort of thing, they'll pop up really high-res photography. Beautiful stuff. It's specifically designed for proliferation. On 2 February, you take a look at this bear. You see the pylons here? They're empty. Can you see that? Well, on 21 Feb, they're not empty anymore. And again, this is meant for us to see. Okay? B-52 movements, those 4 B-52s. Remember, each B-52 can potentially carry 20 cruise missiles with nuclear weapons. 4 B-52s can have a significant impact, right? Well, 15 Feb, I catch one of them off Norway, maybe more. They're squawking with no call sign. 16th, same day, same thing, right? Okay, this is interesting. And then it occurs to me during the Cold War, this was the staging area for British V-Force bombers if they got off the ground from the UK, make their run into the Soviet Union. Well, in this case here, that's your air-launched cruise missile range to target from that area. Look how far in you can get, right? Gets better. The next day, they fly over Sweden, which is ostensibly neutral, hasn't joined NATO yet, right? So, why are they there? Okay, yeah, it extends range and reduces flight time into Russia, but what they're really concerned about here is the Kaliningrad enclave. Now, if you're not familiar with it, this is a piece of East Prussia that was seized by the Soviets at the end of the Second World War and becomes basically a Russian enclave, right? In there, you have the Voronezh early warning radar, ballistic missile early warning radar. Okay? And there's another one in behind here in Belarus. Looks like that. And that's its coverage. Now, if you want to reduce the coverage of the early warning system by taking it out with a cruise missile or cruise missiles, that improves your chances. It reduces the efficiency of the early warning system, which then increases deterrence. Okay? Because you can fire potentially, combat potential, fire something through it. The other things that are sitting down there in Kaliningrad are Iskander missiles, and they're using those to basically bully NATO since about 2015. Okay, so those B-52s likely had target coverage in here, and that's messaging to Russia that you can't use this to escalate because we'll take it out before you use it. Now, Putin will conduct a nuclear command post exercise on the 19th. Every indication is that this was supposed to be, the sequence of events was supposed to be the false flag, then it was going to be the strategic nuclear exercise as a message to the West to stay out of Ukraine, and then the Ukrainian invasion goes in. This is all thrown off because of the moves that were taken earlier. But they can go ahead and conduct the exercise. And then the U.S. starts taking precautions. They increase the number of nuclear command and control aircraft over water. Again, talking to the submarines, letting the other side know. Okay, so on 24 Feb, right before the airstrikes, B-52s are operating off of Sweden, over Sweden, and there's B-52s operating south of Kaliningrad. So my assessment of that is they're offsetting whatever's in here, and whatever Russia does with Ukraine, if they try to play any games with things, there's target coverage so that it can't escalate. And right before the airstrikes, I catch an E-4B, call sign Order 66. Anybody know what that is? What is it?
It's a Star Wars reference, isn't it?
What is this? What's it referring to?
Killing all the Jedi.
Killing all the Jedi. Okay? So all of a sudden, you got a command and control aircraft and a strip alert that's call sign is, kill the other side's leadership. Okay? So these are the conclusions. Then, of course, the war starts, this phase of the war starts. But it's very clear that the nuclear activity that the other side was undertaking is designed to backstop its activities and its gray zone activities. And it was very clearly designed from the other side to signal that they have the ability to escalate. However, in this case, in the West was able to respond and match that. Okay. And that's covered in much more detail, and that will come out in the fall. Like I said, this is very technical stuff. It's obviously a language between the practitioners, but I was able to lift the lid off of it and get a sense of what was going on. That's a lot of activity. That was not happening in 2021. And during the Cold War, for example, in 1956, during the Hungary and Suez crises, the big move there was to fly 72 B-47s, half loaded with nuclear weapons, up to the Arctic, over Canada, so that the other side with drift ice stations could see it and report back to Khrushchev that there's 72 bombers over the Arctic. And it actually worked. Khrushchev did back off. But that was a sort of singular event during a multi-month crisis. Right? Now, look at that compared to this. Okay? Any questions?
So arguably, can't we say that the deterrence of Russia to invade Ukraine failed? Now, it didn't escalate to...
But deterrence wasn't being extended over Ukraine at this point. And actually, you know what? I can explain that. That's very interesting, and this is where it gets really controversial. Back in 2020, the Trump administration was operating B-52s over Ukraine, over the Sea of Azov. I saw them do it. Biden administration replaces them with manned ISR aircraft. As the crisis gets worse, Biden pulls the manned ISR and puts UAVs up, like Global Hawk. Now think about that. What message is that sending? Okay, you can mess around in Ukraine, but we're on the periphery here. Don't go beyond that. Oh, and by the way, if we've got unmanned systems there, if they get hit, too bad, so sad. That's more detail in there. But deterrence is not extended over Ukraine in this case. It's being done to deter Vlad from basically intimidating NATO or intimidating us. Right. That's the way I take it. And by the way, this is early days. I'm open to any other information that expands on this, but this is what I was seeing then, and this is how I interpret it. Does that answer your question?
It does.
Right.
Sean, in this choreography of this saber rattling, what's the political involvement? Are the political hands on the steering wheel, or is this being managed by our generalship?
That's a really good question, because I'm able to correlate most of the Russian moves with other information activities. So for example, if they want to intimidate Poland, they'll trot out Medvedev, and maybe he's drunk and maybe he isn't. If they want to escalate that discussion, then it becomes a Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesman, and then they'll do that. But at the same time, while they're doing that, they'll be moving stuff around. They'll be taking runs at the Polish border with backfire. So there's combinations of things like this. On the U.S. side, it seems to me to be fairly well controlled. I don't see a lot of in any of this. I don't see a lot of cowboying around. And in fact, when you look at American nuclear strategy as it evolves 10 years before this, I've actually found in the documentation that maneuverings of various aircraft types are part of a pre-DEFCON signaling process. So yes, it'll fit within military parameters, but yes, it's been turned on by the politicians. So there's nothing rogue going on here in the West. The French are involved too. Like the French will sortie their ballistic missile submarines out.
Maybe a Canadian politician that's, my goodness, I don't know if we have one, but do we have a Canadian politician that would be watching these leaders and engaging with our...
I was providing advice high up on exactly this, yes. I can't tell you what came out the other end, but I was explaining this to high-level people daily, using open source material.
To what extent, Sean, are both sides misreading each other, especially the Russians, since we know that they're very good at misreading.
I don't know. I'm not sure how to answer that. Aaron.
Okay.
Because there's always this fear going back to poli-sci analysis of signaling and Cold War nuke stuff. That we're going to misunderstand each other and nuke each other into slag. I don't think that's happening here. I think people, from what I can tell, people understand what the language is. And you just can't sit there and let them let the Russians roll over allies and that kind of thing. There's going to be pushback, and there are other things that happen. Like what'll happen after this, when the Russians get frustrated in Ukraine, they'll ramp up gray zone warfare against the northern flank. And then how do you respond to that? How do you deter somebody cutting cables under the sea? That becomes a separate problem. But you're still manipulating nuclear forces around at the same time. And that's happening at this time as well. Who's next? Yeah.
This is very interesting. I was wondering, have you had a chance to look at China in any way?
No, I've been too busy.
Okay.
I don't speak Chinese.
Okay.
So-
But would you like to make a guess as to, okay.
No, I'm not going to hazard a guess on anything related to communist China at this point. I haven't studied it enough. I don't know how they signal, how their behavior is. I only have so much time in the day, and this is what I focus on. So I'm not going to. I wouldn't even try to template that. Yeah.
You look at this a lot from, this is great, and hard, but it's great. A lot to take in. You look at this from a lot from the air and sort of the list. Like, how does cyber now play into sort of signaling and?
That's a really good question, and I don't have the answer to that completely. There's been a lot of debate as to what extent can you use military force to respond to a cyber attack. From what I can tell, during all of this, cyber is built into gray zone warfare stuff that's taking place. It plays a role, obviously, in the initial Russian assault on Ukraine. But in terms of the nuclear force maneuvering, and there's the whole space dimension that we don't see either. I'm showing what we can see. There are clearly other dimensions to this, and some other people in the future will have to take this much further than I've taken it. But we need to start talking about this now because it's really neat stuff and it's going on. It's consequential. But yeah, there are definitely other dimensions to this. Space particularly, and space and cyber cannot be decoupled. Yeah.
With the newfound love for Russia by the American administration, has any of this maneuvering, have you been watching it? Has it changed?
Yes, it's changed.
Oh, wow.
They've started not to squawk their aircraft. So I can't track their aircraft in the same way I used to.
This is the American.
The Americans.
Really?
Really.
That's interesting.
It's very interesting. The other side has dropped, its tempo has definitely dropped off. That's probably sanctions related on one level. Okay? But what's interesting was if I had another half hour and I had another slide deck, I'd show you what happened in February. Because this year. Oh yeah. So what happens is this. Keith Kellogg and crew are putting the pressure on the Russian oil system, economic system, right? And Trump is in support of that. And Putin's getting torqued off because the Manchurian candidate isn't doing what he's told. As one of my friends put it. Anyway, but basically they started manipulating nuclear forces over a 2-day period up in the Arctic. And I could see the tankers lift off, go screaming up into the Arctic, including ours. Okay, so in 2 days in February, so they started maneuvering bombers up there, and we're responding to that. And then about a week later, they started manipulating the ballistic missile stuff. And there's a couple of other things that happened. But the analysis of this was that Putin is displeased because he's not getting his way with Trump. All of a sudden, Trump and crew are saying, "No, we're not your puppet." Now, the problem is what I just described to you is that has to be separated from all the other noise of what's going on, and people keep trying to interpret what I've just described to you through other lenses. I'm just describing it to you from what I'm seeing and what it specifically correlates to. And there's more to that. I'm gonna have to write about that someday. But it was really, really interesting because you can see our guys were just, you can see the tankers just start screaming up to Baffin Island in a conga line. Okay, and that was the reserve tankers from like Tampa. So there's something big going on up there, and then all of a sudden the other side starts coming up with imagery of Tupolev 160 blackjacks flying around up there. Like that's a serious threat, and you got to keep them out of the ADIZ, Canadian ADIZ, because if they're flying further south, all of a sudden they can put the northern tier U.S. bases at risk. So we're back to that kind of language and messaging, right? So you got to keep them pushed back. So that's what was going on. So yeah, no, and when I tried to explain that to the media, they had no clue. Sir.
So you said on the Russian side, who is the center in organizing all this communication?
Yeah.
Who's doing that on the American side?
There's no central person.
But it's not an coordinated response.
It depends when we're talking, and what period we're talking. In this case here, how tightly controlled is what I'm seeing is tightly controlled from the White House. It's probably sec def at that point. It's probably sec def, but it'll be done under guidance of the president. That's my take on it. The Strategic Command is not going to be running off doing its own thing. It may run exercises, but it'll be cognizant. You can see the statements coming out of Lloyd Austin. We're going to launch a ballistic missile out of Vandenberg. It's a routine shot. Has nothing to do with present circumstances globally. Like they'll make announcements like that, or they'll stop a test because it's too proximate to something going on. So that leads me to believe that there was fairly tight coordination on the U.S. side. With Putin, it would be absolute. Yeah.
You say the Americans have turned off the squawkers on many of these aircraft anyway. How does that relate to like principle one of deterrence?
I can't answer that right now because I haven't been looking at it. I'm not kidding. Normally I would watch this like a hawk, but there are other things that have popped up. I've overridden that, or else I could give an answer to you, Bob. So, but there's things that go on too, like when they move B-2s around, you can't see them because they're invisible, right? They're stealth. But what they will announce, we've moved 6 B-2s to Diego Garcia, or somebody will see the logistics apparatus show up beforehand, right? So there are ways of doing it. So, who's next? Yeah.
Again, probably an unanswerable question. Just circle back to the Canadian thing again. Is there any evidence that what was going on with Russian signaling had any effect on the Canadian response to the truck and the convoy?
I've written a whole paper on that, and I'll send it to you. This is where we were talking before about how they misunderstand us. So sometimes when they do these things, they expect to get greater payoff than they actually do, okay, from what I can tell. In this case, they wanted to generate pressure, and they wanted to exacerbate split in the Canada-U.S. relationship, because when they shut the borders down, look what happened, right, economically to the States. So they wanted to aggravate that. And you can see their so-called media themes kept changing like every 3 days into something that was trying to exacerbate the split in the relationship. What they hope to do with that media is to basically try and get the Western outlets to uptake that and rebro that within our environment. And to a certain extent that happened. But again, they wanted to insult Trudeau, which they did. They wanted to demonstrate for their domestic audience that Canada is not really a democracy, it's a fascist state. You know, so they're trying to do everything they can to be disruptive. This doesn't make sense to people like us who are relatively rational, and we wouldn't think about deliberately generating disruption. But that's how they operate. Disruption itself is useful. We don't think that way, they do think that way. Because who has the largest Ukrainian diaspora outside of Ukraine?
Canada.
Right, and if you're doing this, if you're disrupting the country that has the diaspora in the lead up to the war, I can discuss whether that's a coincidence or not. Now the problem is, having this discussion with people who are very emotional about what happened at the time is almost impossible. But I have to look at it this way, given what I do. As much as I may dislike one political party or another or whatever, this is what's going on. Who's right or who's wrong about the trucker convoy becomes irrelevant in the face of like bombers flying around the Arctic, right?
Is the American Secretary of Defense Hexeth capable of handling all this kind of stuff?
I'm not going to answer that question. I'm not going to. Not even going to bother with that. I don't know him. Do you?
That's why he's asking.
I've never met him. Remember, in every case, and I speak as an historian, the public depiction or presentation of any given political figure is not necessarily what's going on. Go back at Eisenhower and look how everybody thought he didn't know what the hell was going on. He's playing golf all the time, having a heart attack, blah, blah, blah. Meanwhile, he's getting the U.S. into space, running U-2s over the Soviet Union, build up the largest nuclear armada in history, okay? So this is why I'm very leery about passing instant judgment necessarily. But you never know.
Any more questions for Dr. Sean?
Yeah.
On the Tomahawks, I don't remember when this happened, maybe you do, but the U.S. government leaked out to the media at some point in time, it might have been during the war before, that they had a conversation with the Russians and reminded them that the United States has more than sufficient conventional capabilities to counterstrike Russia's entire nuclear architecture, essentially. Tomahawks being part of that, but other capabilities too. That we don't need to use our nukes to completely decapitate everything you've got. And that was the message that they had delivered, fairly frankly, to the Russians at some point in time.
Well, in October, where were you in October 2022?
Where was I? I was here following the war.
Yeah, well, I mean, there was a night things got kind of tense. And it took another identification of the location of the ballistic missile submarine to calm it down. So, yeah, they wouldn't have relied solely on a conventional deterrence. That's not possible.
No, they wouldn't, but...
I mean, this is where, we get to update our thinking from the Cold War, where you have conventional and nuclear forces blended to accomplish an objective. And that's what's happened. That's part of the strategy now. That's some of what we're seeing here. Okay? Right on. Any other questions? Right on. Thanks very much.
Sean, thank you very much.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now, and thank you for joining us.